James Mercer Langston Hughes was an African-American poet, novelist, playwright whose work contributed to the Harlem Renaissance of 1920. Langston Hughes was born February 1st, 1902 in Joplin, Missouri. His parents were two bookkeepers who later divorced shortly after Langston's birthday. His father moved to Mexico and his mother was always in search of employment, so Langston was raised by his grandmother until the age of 12. And after that, he moved back with his mother and her husband in Lincoln, Illinois. He attended Topeka Elementary School, and he lived with his mother for a short
Their
time.
home in Cleveland was foreclosed in 1918 for $16,667. One of his teachers introduced him to the poetry of Carl Sandburg and Walt Whitman, both whom Hughes would later cite as primary influences. His first piece of jazz poetry was written while he was in high school, When Sue Wears Red. Hughes was also a regular contributor to his school's literary magazine and frequently submitted to other poetry magazines, although they would ultimately reject him. Hughes graduated from high school in 1920 and spent the following year in Mexico with his father. Around this time, Hughes' poem, The Negro Speaks of River, was published in Crisis magazine and was highly praised. During his time in England in the early 1920s, he became part of the black exploiters community. In 1921, Hughes returned to the United States and enrolled at a Columbia University where he studied briefly, and during which time he quickly became part of the Harlem Burgundy and cultural movement, what commonly known as the Harlem Renaissance. Hughes was also received a scholarship to attend Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. While studying at Lincoln, Hughes' poetry came to attention of novelist critic Carl Van Vychte. Hughes dropped out of Columbia in 1922 and worked various odd jobs around New York for the following year before signing on a steward on a freighter that took him to Africa and Spain. He spent 6 months traveling to West Africa and Europe. He also served at a brief tenure as a crewman aboard the SS Malone in 1920.
In 1924, he returned to the U.S. to live with his mother in Washington, D.C. He left the ship in 1924 and lived for a brief time in Paris, where he continued to develop publishing his poetry. He gained a white-collar job in 1925 as a personal assistant historian Carter G. Woodson. In 1925, he was working as a busboy in Washington, D.C. hotel when he met American poet Vanchel Lindsay. Hughes showed some of his poems to Lindsay, who was impressed enough to use his connections to his poem, Hughes' Poetry Unlimited. In 1925, Hughes' poem, The Wearly Blues, won first prize in Opportunity Magazine Literary Competition. The book had popular appeal and established both his poetic style and his commitment to black themes and heritage. He published a second volume of poetry, Fine Clothes to the Jew, in 1927. After his graduation from Lincoln in 1929, Hughes published his first novel, Not Without Laughter. The book was commercially successful enough to convince Hughes that he could make a living as a writer. During 1930, Hughes would frequently travel the United States on lectures, tours, and also abroad, the Soviet Union, Japan, Haiti. He continued to write and publish poetry, and Hughes died on December 20th, 1988, but his legacy and creativity still lives on.